Kick it off. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is TJ Kelly, Commercial Executive with RaySecur. I will be your host and moderator for today's expert panel discussion. So joining us for our discussion today are our panelists, Mr. Jeffrey Slotnick and Mr. William Plummer. Jeff Slotnick is the president of Setracon Enterprise Security Risk Management Services, a company focused on professional services related to risk consulting, ESRM, and other aspects of physical security. Jeff is a recognized authority in critical infrastructure protection, where he assists organizations with creating standards, developing training programs, and managing assessments. Jeff is actively involved in ASIS International as Senior Regional Vice President, Director for the Professional Standards Board, and past Chair of the Physical Security Council. That is quite a bit. Welcome, Jeff, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, TJ. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Sharing knowledge is always of great importance, and this subject that we're going to be discussing today is of great importance.
Excellent, and we're glad to have you on board. Thank you, Jeff. Our second panelist is Mr. William Plummer. Will is Chief Security Officer for RaySecur, where he advises Fortune 500 companies and other high-profile organizations on their mail security and guides their threat mitigation process. Will is a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Army, where he served as a Master Explosive Ordnance, or EOD, technician. He commanded multiple special operations support units and served as a certified EOD team leader and master instructor. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College with a master's degree in defense and strategic studies. So thank you for joining us, Will.
Thank you, TJ. Glad to be here.
Two quick housekeeping items for everybody joining our event today. First, this webinar is being recorded. So for those who would like a video copy of this event afterward, we will send that out. And second, we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please do stick around and please feel free to submit questions as we go along. So without any further ado, what I'd like to do is first throw it over to Jeff. Jeff, you are an ESRM expert, and I'm sure most of our viewers today are familiar with ESRM, but can you give us some background, especially on how that applies to mailroom security?
Well, to simplify it, ESRM is the business of security. In many organizations, security is often seen as a cost center, and they don't identify the contribution of the security department to the overall mission and strategy of the business. What ESRM does, Enterprise Security Risk Management, is align the mission of the security department with the mission and strategy of the organization, so that in essence, the security program is identifying risks that can impact the strategy of the organization, and there's business alignment. Oftentimes, security professionals, they speak security really clearly. What they don't speak is the language of business. And the COO, the CFO, the CEO, they all speak business. So ESRM provides the tools to have that kind of language. We start with identifying and prioritizing the assets of the organization. We look at potential loss events and threats that can impact the organization. And those threats and impacts can be many things. A person-made disaster, crime and terrorism, a natural disaster like we're experiencing today with COVID. Look at the impacts on the global supply chain of COVID. And then, developing the systems, processes, and tools to mitigate that and ensure the resilience and viability of the enterprise in the face of adversity.
Yeah, that's quite a bit there. And we have already had a number of questions submitted previously for registration for this event, many of which hit on the topics you're introducing there, Jeff. So I'm sure we'll come back around to dig a little deeper on some of that. And thank you for the introduction. Will, I'm going to throw it over to you next. We've heard you say on events similar to this one in the past that security teams often misunderstand or miscalculate the weight and the importance of mail and the risk that it poses to an organization. So could you tell us a bit about that and kind of elaborate for us?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that go on out there. It's just perceptions, what people think the reality is, what the threats are, and what people believe that the threat stream is going to look like. And honestly, a lot of times that weighting is just done wrong. The people tend to think of mail as an individual event. I've talked to security leaders in major companies who said, I don't have a mail problem. And their next couple sentences are instances where they had a mail problem. We had that gun, well, we had that powder, and I had that hazmat team, and they'll still run down the road of, I don't have a problem with this. There's also something short of, we look for who your advocate or who your champion is. Often the mailroom or other logistical functions are spread across multiple organizations. It could be the facilities team that's responsible for all the day-to-day actions of dealing with the mailroom or the system that it's about. It's probably not the security team. Yet the response is going to be the security team, and they're the ones that have the responsibility for taking care of whatever happens. So instead of the individual events, it needs to be looked at as a constant threat stream that's coming in their facility. Another problem is getting leadership to buy in regularly. If you look at some of these facilities, they do come across as individual stovepiped functions in the same organization. Oftentimes, that's even made worse because some of these companies have a third party that's managing the outsourced portion of it. So they're not necessarily true whatever company card holders. They are a subcomponent that they have a problem with communications between what I can tell you to do for your job description versus what we want you to do. It's there's a lot of different aspects to that become problematic.
You know, if I could piggyback off that for a moment, Will, you know, the first thing that we have to do, and we're defining a problem, is identify what the problem is.
Okay.
And we have a process for that, which is actually early on in the ESRM process, and that's called a risk, threat, and vulnerability assessment. You know, by aligning the risk assessment with the enterprise mission and looking at what risks can impact, including mailroom security, you know, we get a great path forward that allows us to show value and justify the need for a mitigation to the organization or the enterprise. So a risk assessment leads to identification of problems or vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities lead to mitigations. And, you know, the solutions that you're providing certainly fall under the category of mitigation, especially in the context of a mailroom. And I can tell you, having been in and out of a lot of corporate and government mailrooms, there is certainly a significant amount of vulnerability there.
Let me add one more thing to it. There's also what's the measurement of success, right? So for security, speed is not necessarily the most important thing to us. It's oftentimes, you know, making sure that everybody's safe and life limit property will go home. For success, per se, the logistics function, it's definitely speed. So some of the measurements for success oftentimes do not counterbalance each other very well. You end up with things that are very divergent.
And you're right. And that's when we look at the context of what it is that we're doing and how we're applying a solution within that context. You know, because a manufacturing facility is very different than a distribution facility, is very different than a water utility or an electric utility or a transit agency. All these have different contexts that we need to consider.
Absolutely.
So maybe to play off of that a bit, one of the questions we had submitted previously was just a policy kind of overview question, how to start a mailroom security program. And it sounds like we're already outlining bits and pieces that, right, first defining the problem, some of the other things we've talked about. But if you zoom out a level and say, I want to put together a program, maybe my company is small and has never had one before, or this has recently become a high priority based on an incident or something along those lines, what might the structure look like and the first steps look like for starting a mailroom security program? And Jeff, let's go first to you.
Well, you know, to start with, you have to consider what it is you're going to be doing. Are we screening packages? Are we screening just envelope mail? Are we the shipping and receiving department for a large corporation with lots of inbound materials? So understanding, you know, the scope of your project and what the nature of the needs are for your mailroom are very important. You know, a major corporation that has UPS deliveries, has FedEx deliveries, has Amazon deliveries, plus mail for 400 employees or more. That's a pretty significant size mailroom. So, you know, when you get into it, you have to understand what it is you need to do so that you can set up an appropriate facility. And maybe it's an offsite warehouse. Maybe it's a zone within the building, a protected zone. But what it shouldn't be is, someplace, unused utility room in the basement that we want to put this high priority function into.
Will, anything to add on that?
Yeah. So on top of that, and Jeff's absolutely right. What are you going to do? What's your desired end state? What are you looking for? The other half is you should be looking at profiling yourself. What's going to come at you, right? So if you are an organization that is highly political, you should be looking at just about every single thing that's coming into your facility. If you know that that's what's coming at you, that's how you should handle yourself. But if you're a smaller organization, like you mentioned, TJ, that's got a handful of employees and only has a minor footprint, well, who actually gets the public's attention within that organization? Do you need to screen everything? The TSA looks at everything and they have a high failure rate for several reasons. Could you focus your efforts for that small entity on what most likely is going to end up inside of your perimeter that's a problem? Most likely, most dangerous, those types of things. So looking at your desired end state and then adding on top of that, what's most likely to come at you would help.
An interesting point there that you make, and I think quantifying the threat and the impact of that threat on the organization, and having the realization that, it doesn't even have to be a real item. It can be a hoax.
Absolutely.
A white powder hoax can shut down a facility for more than 7 days, while everything is looked for, examined, sent to labs to determine whether it's real or not. So 7 days you're outside of the workplace. If you have an organization, let's just say it's 200 employees. So what's the cost of not being able to be on site for 200 days? What's the cost of not being able to produce what you produce? What's the impact on stakeholder relationships when when you can't deliver your product to your clients? So all that has to be considered an imputed value when you're looking at your design and how you're going to build this facility. Even a bomb threat, somebody identifies a suspicious package and they don't have the appropriate plans in place. We get the suspicious package that fits the description of that may contain a hazardous device. You've got to evacuate the building. You've got to call in law enforcement. You have to have a plan. Somebody has to investigate. Somebody has to inspect, and somebody has to determine it's all clear to bring everybody back. What is the actual value of that entire process, and what's the cost to the enterprise in finances and lost hours and equipment, and everything else?
That's a hard number to quantify. In fact, we've talked to a lot of our clients about that, and it's a big number, no matter which way you pull about it. You pull 7 days times all the other stuff. The other thing that we found, I think about this stuff a lot, is look at Subway last year. When Subway got hit with that white powder threat, they were shut down for 4 hours. It was quick. It hit their headquarters here in Connecticut. The downside to it is the local news reported on it that one night, they're good. Hit the national news, and the individual who sent the white powder got exactly what they wanted. They started bringing up Jared Fogle. They brought up that they laid people off, and that's why it showed up. Basically, the corporation was blamed. The victim was blamed because they did something that somebody else perceived to be improper, incorrect. And the money, absolutely. And a lot of these companies nowadays, they're also worried about what that little bit of powder gets you in the perception of the public stage, what that 24-hour news cycle will do to you for something that is not your fault.
Brand notoriety cost.
Yep.
Jeff, as you were describing your answer here, we had a question come in. Perhaps this could kind of bounce off of what you were saying a minute ago. The question is there a substantial emphasis currently being placed on security of inbound logistics, i.e. guard at the gate? So when you talk about location of mailrooms and kind of the layout of the facility, how does the guard at the gate example here play into any of that?
Well, one of the fundamentals of security is a layered approach. And, you start at the entrance to your facility at the gate. Rudimentary screening should be done right there. And whoever's at the gate that has that screening responsibility needs to have the tools, techniques, and training in order to be able to be effective at that screening point. So you have, as a delivery progresses through a facility from the gate into the mailroom and then into the organization, there should be different types of screening at each location, each that ensure that, you know, we're getting something that's safe and non-hazardous into the protected environment.
And Will, you talk a lot about the visual and tactical screening, excuse me, that play into what Jeff is describing here. What else can we add to that, and what else might we add on, in terms of an answer to this question?
So visual tactile inspection is the first thing that everybody can do. You don't need technology or anything. And if you look at the history of suspect packages, they're almost always found by somebody looking at it and going, that's weird, right? Train your people, put a little bit of ownership on everybody. So one thing that's interesting is you talk to a lot of people and they say, oh, USPS, UPS, it's going through a screening criteria. It's not. Everything gets dropped. It gets thrown in a box with some stamps on it. The onus is on the person that's addressed to. They're the ones that are going to end up eating all this pain and frustration. If you, in your layered defense, like Jeff mentioned, have people that take a spot check, that look and step in and go, yeah, this looks okay to me, or this looks really strange, let's pull this aside, and make it everybody's kind of job, you'll increase your overall defenses significantly without putting a lot of cost into it.
There was a separate question, since you mentioned training personnel, that was submitted earlier, about, mail check and mail scanning training has to be given to those receiving the mail. Is this being followed is the question. So, in your exposure to the security world and security teams in corporate America and other organizations, how prevalent is this training? Are folks being successful with it? What sorts of things are you seeing out there?
I spend a lot of time in mailrooms and helping people out and talking to them. And I'd say, by and large, there is training out there. Whether it's being implemented or enforced is another question. And it really depends on the amount of emphasis by the management or by individuals that are responsible for securing the function. One of the things that I do see a lot of the time, especially with larger companies, like I mentioned in the beginning, is misalignment of tasks versus security related requirements. The person moving the logistics function, point A to point B, that's focused on speed, isn't the one that's really going to pay attention to, is this going to the CEO? Should this take a second look and slow this down? And that's another way to fix it, is kind of empower more individuals in the process.
One of the things that I see a lot, and this is going to be a bit US centric, and I know that we have folks from around the world that are on this webinar, but the US Postal Service has provided a lot of information in fundamental training and requirements, and there's actually standards for mailrooms and mailroom security that can be followed. One of the things that I see a lot of is that a person that is assigned to duties that are required for supervising a mailroom may not necessarily have the security background and training to be effective in mailroom security. Sometimes what it requires is a liaison or an alignment with the security management team to have that security oversight of the mailroom and ensure that the plan, policies, procedures, techniques, and equipment are in place to be effective and have a secure mailroom.
Mm-hmm. And we just had a question come in that might just ask you to keep going here, Jeff. The question essentially is how? What's the strategy to get everyone involved in the mail security? We understand that as the goal, but what can we do on the ground to help kind of actually make that effective and make it successful?
Well, it's just like any other function. First off, again, it starts with a risk assessment and identifying the problem. Once we've identified the problem, then we can quantify what needs to happen for training, who needs to be trained. You need to have a good, well-written and practiced policy and procedure. It can't just be a blue book on the shelf, that somebody says, hey, we've got a policy. It needs to be a policy and procedure that's understood, read, practiced, evaluated. What we call 360-degree evaluation. Is it, we have the policy, are we training the policy? Are we practicing it? Are we doing exercises? What do we do when we find something? So all of that is wrapped up into a comprehensive program. And that's the way that we have to look at it, as a 360-degree approach. But this is a process of continuous improvement. It's just like any other quality management process. We don't do it once and forget about it and then walk away. We have to have iterative exercises. We learn from our errors, and then we change our policy and procedure to accommodate the new learnings so that the next time we don't make the same error. And over time, we get progressively better, kind of the crawl, walk, run methodology for moving in a program. So, ideally what we want to do is we want to get to that run state. But even after we're at that run state, there's maintenance that needs to occur. There's retraining, there's new concepts, there's new technologies. I will tell you that, having been in the security industry now for 21 years and the military prior to that, technology around mailrooms has changed significantly. The technology that RaySecur has today is very, very different than what was available in the market even 10 years ago.
So another thing to add to that is if you're going to do something, and Jeff is on point as always, is it needs to be relevant and repeatable. Whatever you're doing needs to be something that doesn't require a Herculean amount of effort to get some of these people retrained, retasked, or reworked. That's oftentimes where some people come into problems with, because they'll put something together, this great test procedure, this fantastic stuff, that first off, it's hard to get people in the mailroom in the first place to get that much amount of logistics efforts behind them. The second is it's got to be relevant, repeatable, so that they can do it on their own, because leadership's not going to step down every 5 seconds. Management's not going to be able to put their hand on this on a daily basis. This is something that needs to stay monitored and maintained, but something that can be done it's quasi independently. So there's a few nuances to doing things in mailrooms that are a little harder than they should be in some areas.
And Will, you've talked a number of times in the past about getting an SOP program, for example, to formalize all of this. Jeff, I'm sure that that plays well into your expertise. So to kind of move in that direction of formalizing it and putting policies so that it can be a program can be implemented here. Let's talk about the data that you've compiled, Will, that's informing some of this these decisions for you. So what types of delivery methods are you seeing as a threat or emerging trends that, especially with the pandemic or before or after, what sorts of data are you seeing that's kind of helping informing some of these decisions?
Let's look at some of the recent events. Rand Paul, that man is his mail is screened, just about everybody and their brother, right? Goes to inside the Beltway, gets looked at, and then gets delivered to his house, and it shows up, and he opens up, he's exposed to white powder. Dr. Fauci, same thing. The Arizona Republicans, the week before Senator Rand Paul was hit. That is what the threat is rotating towards. Small white powder events that are going to cause a response that, even if it's just a few grains of salt on somebody's table, they're going to react to it. Add a couple little nuance to that. I am a member of IABTI, background bomb guy, so I think about that stuff. I heard a very interesting conversation and speech by two of the leading people in the community that said bombs don't tick anymore. When I grew up learning what a bomb was, you'd look for timers, you could hear things, all the key ID features from before. Now what you're looking at is solid state. It's off the shelf. It doesn't make any noise. There's no key identification features for it. If you look at what threats look like now, these people who are being laid off, they're frustrated or upset, there's a good chance that they're going to know how to spell the CEO's name and spell it correctly. And a lot of the things that we historically have identified as high threat key ID features just simply aren't there anymore. It's small things that weigh less than 10 ounces, less than half an inch thick. You can put stamps on it, drop it into a collection bin, so there's no chain of custody. That's what they look like.
And Jeff, you had mentioned the technology side of this and obviously playing into business. Based on the data and the sort of the trends that we're seeing and some of the others, is there kind of a low-hanging fruit? And this plays off a question that was submitted just a minute ago. A good place to start, is technology the right place for a company to start if they're just starting to get into this? And I know we've asked iterations of this in the past, but to bring in technology, to bring in some of the trends that are emerging, what can a company do for these low-hanging fruit types of opportunities?
Well, understand that, again, we're getting back to a core concept of physical security. Good physical security is a combination of equipment, people, policies, and procedures. You can have all the equipment in the world, but if you don't have anybody that knows how to use it effectively or to use it at all, then it's just a piece of equipment sitting there. So, it needs to be a holistic program. So you have to have quality people that are trained to use the equipment, and the equipment has to be effective for the threats that you might face. You know, whether it's millimeter wave, whether it's some other product, whether it's a sniffer detection, you know, there's all kinds of technologies out there. But you need to look at, again, what are your threats? And once you understand what your threats are, then you can develop your policies and procedures and training around and equipment around those potential threats. You know, you also have to look at the size of package that you're going to be screening. You know, is this something that can pass through a TSA type portal in a tunnel? Or is this something that we've got an entire vehicle that we have to screen coming through, you know, like an MVACA system or some of those other tools that are out there. So, you know, you have to look at what it is that you're doing and what your mission is and what types of packages and how often they're coming in, what's the frequency, you know, and there's also a lot of ground level things that can be done. You know, getting back to the gate, you know, you can establish a delivery time for Amazon. You can establish a delivery time for UPS. You can ask for an assigned driver to a route. So when that person comes in, they're familiar. And if you see someone that is not familiar, okay, that's when you go to secondary questioning. If they arrive outside their scheduled delivery time, that's another issue that should raise suspicion. So there's a lot of really neat things that can be done to increase security.
And each of those strikes me as something that could be done with minimal impact to your own operations, right? So those seems like a pretty good place to start. Will, anything to bounce off any of that?
Yes, proactivity. I mean, Jeff, again, on the head. It's doing things that proactively protect yourself and your organization. And a lot of things like, hey, my wife knows what mail is going to hit the house before it shows up because she turned it on. USPS sends an email every day. So we know exactly what's in the mailbox. Companies have that same capability. If you lean forward logistically with whenever your multifunctional logisticians, whoever you manage and maintain these tasks with, they should know what's showing up. Yeah, you can tell Amazon to show up during the time, that's dead on. You can also know exactly what's coming, and anything that falls outside of that is where you focus your efforts. There's a lot of little tricks that you can do, and especially the farther we get into the technological world, where we have more information and more control over things that were historically dark operations. Like if I drop something in a mailbox, it's never going to see the light of day except when it shows up in mine. It's in a bag the rest of the way. That's not true anymore. Now there's a picture taken, images can be sent. The same thing with all your other logistics functions. Most of them, you can lean forward and know exactly what's showing up before it gets there.
So I want to bring this back to Jeff. And before I do that, I want to be respectful of folks' time. We're coming up on 2:30. We advertise this as a 30-minute webinar. We do have a number more questions to get through. If folks are willing to stick around, we would love to have you. We're going to keep going. If not, if you do have to leave after our half hour here, like I said, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll send the video around. Feel free to watch it at your own convenience afterward. For those who are going to stick around, however, I want to bring it back to Jeff, kind of tie this back into the business side of things. This question that was submitted here, it says, many companies are tenants in Class A buildings. How do you get building management to invest in screening the mail at the loading dock level? And I'm including this under business now, since a security team might have to liaise with facilities management, which might be a third party or different building ownership. That is separate from just the security team. So how do we kind of group these things together, and how do those work? What would be our best strategy here?
Well, security coverage when you're a tenant in a building covers many different aspects, and those are things that when you inform your real estate acquisition people before they sign that lease, before they make that agreement, what are your needs and what is your risk and threat? And is that building appropriate for you? If you're already there and you've got to backtrack and deal with your current situation, sometimes it's just a conversation with building management, because you're not the only one or the only tenant in that building that's facing a similar threat. And one white powder threat or one bomb threat doesn't affect just your office. It affects and impacts the entire facility. So it's a conversation that should be had. But in the case that you can't, then you have two other decisions to make. One, Do I procure an offsite location for mail delivery and then pick it up from my offsite location and bring it to my facility? That's one choice. The other is third-party screening services. In most major cities, there are third-party mail screening services that can accomplish that task for you. And all your mail goes there, it's screened, and then when you pick it up, it's sanitized and you're in good shape. So just some options to consider when you're in a multi-tenant facility.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to change the subject a tiny bit here. There are a number of questions submitted about the technology and different tools that are out there. The first is about automated threat detection. So Will, I know we deal with this on a number of occasions. What do you know about automated threat, and what are your kind of words of wisdom there?
So there's something to be said for automatic threat detection. There's a lot of really good equipment out there that will do a really good job at identifying what's going on. The downside to it is you have to know what it's telling you to then read it correctly and then respond appropriately. A lot of times you'll get companies that think it's just going to give me an alert, then I have to do something. Well, that's not necessarily the best way of running things. If you're using an itemizer or something that's going to give you a chemical breakdown or component of what's going on, that's only as good as the library that's in it, right? So if you don't have the library that's going to appropriately identify what the threat vector is that you're looking at, it's just going to give you a false positive. And that's where you end up with a lot of false positives. The other side, if you're looking at visual screening equipment, X-ray, whatever else is out there, there are, again, a lot of false positives, but there's nothing that can be really replaced the human being that takes a look at what's going on. You need to have the human aspect involved. If you think that there's something that's going to cover you without putting a security professional in that decision process, you're setting yourself up for some false positives and bad days.
Jeff, let's go back to you on some of this. So for a security company, you mentioned the third party screening, for example. If I'm in a tenant building and I need to increase my security, I go to a third party. Or for a company that might offer that as a service. How often does this kind of come up in your world, and what other kind of details can you fill in for us on how to enhance that security by way of third party, or kind of along those lines?
Well, it's essentially a financial decision. Do you already have a safe mailroom space? Do you have the ability to grow it? Do you have space for the equipment? Are you willing to invest in having the plans, policies, procedures, training of individuals? I mean, all that comes at an expense, so do you have that, or are you better off going with mail screening as a service to an offsite provider? When you're presenting as the security manager or security director, when you're presenting these choices to senior management, what you should do is the cost benefit analysis on both. What's the cost benefit analysis of having it in-house? What's the cost benefit analysis of considering it as a service? I mean, much like guards, we make a decision. Do I want proprietary guards, or do I want contract guards? With contract guards, yes, you offload some of your liability, you offload program management, you offload hiring, and all that goes to the contractor. But what's your trade-off? You don't have direct supervision over that guard force. It's all done by the quality of your service level agreement and the quality of your key performance indicators and metrics that you write into your contract. So if you are going to go with an offsite option, you need to ensure that you have a well-written contract, that you've done your research, that you understand what you need, that you can include those items within an SLA, and that you have the proper key performance metrics and indicators to show that you are achieving success in your needs.
So, Will, let's keep going on the cost benefit analysis topic. And this question is about the cost and effectiveness of the latest technology for corporate mailrooms. You mentioned the cost of a shutdown, the cost of a hoax. That all has to get factored into this cost benefit analysis. But looking specifically at the technology side, what can you tell us about some of the other tools and what costs might look like?
So there's a few things about cost benefit analysis with technology. Jeff is dead on about it comes down to budgetary requirement. Can you do this? A lot of our clients, for example, aren't willing to put that cost into it. They've done the CBA and they look at it and they're like, it's not something I'm willing to do. And in fact, a lot of them are, let's just say, confined or constrained by the cost to do some of these screening technologies. If you want to spend a lot of money, you can spend 6 figures on screening, systems that will tell you all sorts of stuff. Most of the sensible response, most of the time that we talk to, is things that you can do on a regular month-to-month contract. You don't necessarily need to go out and spend $150,000 on the most, greatest air sniffer out there, because what it's going to do is tell you a lot of stuff that's in the air. And there's a lot of stuff that you don't really care that's in the air that will cause you to stop your day to deal with it. When it tells you that somebody's brought explosives in, well, no, Jim spent the weekend on the farm with Grandpa Bill, and they've got fertilizer out there. So Jim does not have explosives, but that's what your system just told you. A lot of it has to do with applying a common sense filter on what you're looking at, and putting your budgetary requirements or capabilities, coupling those with the threats that you've identified through your threat analysis. That's what's most likely to come at you, and then trying to find a common sense answer in the middle. And like I said, it's relevant and repeatable.
Jeff, there is a question here about licenses required to operate mail scanners, which clearly, RaySecur has a foot in, horse in that race already. But, in terms of cost benefit and all that, what about licensing? And I guess that kind of also plays into training. There's a question here about how often to retrain employees. So if you're thinking a little bit longer term, and you have to think about, annual retraining, annual licensing, and that sort of stuff, how does the business side, calculate and factor in some of those parts?
Well, there's 2 types of training. There's training on what we already know that helps us to maintain a level of information. And then there's training for new technologies or new changes. So, having a training program as a whole should support the mission of your organization. And that requires, that's a little bit deeper look. That requires a job task analysis. What is it that I'm requiring my people to do? And then when we hire the people for that position, they should have the competencies and the fundamental training to achieve that job. But then we have to look deeper into what actual things we want them to do. So if there's a particular machine that you want them to operate, and then you have to get with the manufacturer, you have to see if they're, for example, if it's using, radiological materials to scan something like an X-ray machine, then, there is licensing for that type of machine, but the manufacturer can provide a lot of training. So, and they will have any certifications that are required, and they'll be determining whether is this, 6 months as needed, trained once and go do good, or, is it an engaged service provider that says, hey, we're upgrading this machine from 1.0 to 2.0, and these are the things that you need to know to be an efficient operator in 2.0. So it's a complex question,
Yep.
On how frequently you should retrain. But triggers for retraining are new threats, new technologies, new policies and procedures, new employees. All are good triggers for retraining and continuous improvement training.
The new triggers is a valuable takeaway right there. So Will, I want to throw it back over to you. This is a question about the pandemic. There's a question here specifically about Canada. We mentioned earlier that this has been a fairly US centric so far, but if we think a little bit more global, what else can we tell about pandemic statistics, and what else do we know about how the pandemic has affected these sorts of stats and incidents that have happened around the world?
So the pandemic has changed a little bit about what threats look like. Everybody went to buying everything in the mail, so we got a lot more Amazon, a lot more other things, HelloFresh or whatever else is going on. But for threats, what it does is actually changed what targets have been hit. So, for example, people were very frustrated with the government. Canada had a bunch of anti-vaxxing people that were delivering white powder threats to labs that were doing research. There was a bunch of cryptocurrency stuff that started happening. People started to send more threats via the mail due to standoff requirements, because nobody could stand next to each other. So it was a viable way of reaching out and doing something. They also realized that you could say a lot with it. And there's a lot of death threats, increase in coercion. There's a huge jump in white powder threats that have been going on around the world. It's, I guess I gave you some examples earlier. It's been aimed at presidents and kings. So the reality is it's increasing in, let's just say, the frequency of the legitimate threats are getting sent out, but the targets are shifting significantly as well. Government, facilities where people have an interaction with the local populace, even to DMVs, judges, courthouses, where I'm not going to go to court today. I'm going to send, you should be a bomb threat. That's what everybody'd say. Call it a bomb threat, you get out of school for the day. Now, schools across New York, 12 of them got white powder threats, and we all ended up out of school for a week. Kids, that's the new thing, is to send white powder threats in.
So with both of you being former military, one of the questions submitted here is how important is the use of open source intelligence? So Jeff, let's go back to you first. You know, you talked about new incidents being one of the triggers for retraining, for example. You know, where might folks get that sort of data? Obviously, we kind of collect and provide some of that by way of Will and his team, but what else can a security team be doing to collect these sorts of data through open source or other means?
Well, you know, open source collection is a science in itself, and this is probably we probably don't have enough time in this forum to explore that. But open source is definitely a means of collecting information, of looking at threats, at identifying issues and events to your organization. The good news is that you don't necessarily need a threat intelligence person, you know, on your staff. A lot of that can be outsourced. There's, you know, 4 or 5 different quality services that will do that monitoring for you. There's also, you know, softwares that'll monitor social media feeds and things like that for potential threats or early notification. But, you know, I'll tell you, I mean, in my own business, we do a lot of open source collection. I start every day and end every day and spend my lunchtime reading. What am I reading? I'm reading BBC, Al Jazeera, the Wall Street Journal, you know, and Reuters. And when you look at those 4 news sources, you know, follow the money, see who's being impacted. And you can discern a lot from what's going on around the world and world affairs when you learn to read between the lines. Another aspect to open source is the ability to do deep dive internet searches. You know, the symbology for doing specific searches on the internet for specific data. I can't teach that here. That's a long course. There's a lot of folks that teach that. But yes, definitely open source is a great tool to inform your threat program.
You'd be surprised how many military operations are actually run off what people find on Google. You're sitting in places in the world that are not fun to be at, and somebody in a room with no windows leans over and goes, "Look what I just found, open source." Like, we don't even have that on ours. It's extremely useful.
And so maybe as part of that, you know, well, I know you and your team do a lot of data collection. There was a string of events. You mentioned Canada with cryptocurrency and a number of others. New York had schools shut down. Was it late last year, early this year? There were a string of events in Germany, as I recall.
Yeah.
Can you just talk to us about what types of threats we're seeing in international, if it's Europe or elsewhere, in the data that you've collected through open source and other means?
So last couple months, India had a parcel bomb that went off that was aimed at a district or provincial leader. Germany had 3 devices that were mailed to 3 food companies' headquarters. We've had a large spat of white powder threats get sent across and around. Quite a few incendiary devices that have been sent across Europe, primarily out of some places that have a history of doing that. And it's globally, it's the gambit of everything. There's full-blown IEDs all the way down to cryptocurrency extortion events, to, like I said, all sorts of stuff. In the States, it's primarily white powder and other events. We have 2 or 3 detonations a year, but internationally, because mail gives you standoff, it gives the person the ability to feel like they're anonymous. They're not really, they're gonna get wrapped up fairly quickly. But people who don't necessarily think about the second, third order effects of their actions quickly think that when they drop something in the mailbox and send it away, it's not coming back to them, and they're gonna reap the benefits of whatever they're sending out. So globally, it's been a little bit more wild west than what we've seen in the States. Here's been primarily white powder, liquids, and smaller things of that effect.
TJ, just something I'd like to cover real quickly before you move on to the next subject, and it's germane to this. You know, folks, you learn your future by studying your past. You know, if you want to do some interesting reading, read the FBI report on Tim McVeigh, read the Department of Justice report on the Unabomber. I mean, these, you know, once you can get into the mind of the folks that have facilitated past events, it'll really help you to understand what to look for and where threats may be coming from.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, there is quite a bit of information there. All of it fascinating. Some of it, you know, maybe not made for light reading, but you're right. It obviously can be quite informative. So we've made it through our list of questions from users submitting those. So if there are any others that our attendees want to submit, please feel free to do that now. Otherwise, gentlemen, I'd like to throw it back for maybe any closing thoughts, you know, call it closing arguments, whatever you want the takeaway from today to be. So Will, can we start with you on what your takeaway is for, you know, for our audience today?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we find, or that I see across most of the people we go talk to, is the difference between the suspect package that everybody has plans for, right? Everybody's got they've got the emergency action plan, emergency response plan for a suspect package in the front lobby. And then they try to apply that to the same problem set in the back in that basement mailroom that Jeff mentioned earlier. That's a very different scenario. Oftentimes we see people that go, yeah, it's suspect package, we'll handle it as such. Well, no, you're not stopping all your operations. You can't get your way maneuver around it. It's sitting in the middle of your facility already. So then they decide that they're just going to, like, all right, well, wait for the security guy to come by on Friday. I've stood inside of facilities and looked at 6 or 7 suspect letters that were there for days, just sitting in the corner in the room because it said, Greg comes by Friday at 3 o'clock and takes a look at all things that we think are suspect. That's problematic. You need to really reassess what people are doing and see if you can have somebody from, I'm not saying a disinterested third party, but bring in somebody to take a look at what you're doing and kind of quality assure, quality check, and common sense check some of those functions. Thanks.
Jeff?
Yeah, in my world, it all starts with a risk assessment. You know, you have to understand what your problem is so that you can apply the appropriate mitigation to prevent that problem from occurring. You know, you look at it, let's look at it from the point of view of a car, okay? You wouldn't just look at a car dealership and say, here's $20,000, provide me a car, or here's $40,000, provide me a car. You're going to want an automobile that fits your needs. If you need to haul things, you're going to want a small truck. If you're going to want to transport people, you're going to want a van. So you have to establish understanding what your problem and your use case and what it is that you're trying to mitigate before you start spending money. So if there was one takeaway from people for this, the entry into ESRM, the entry into security management, the entry into mailroom security starts with a good, high quality risk, threat, and vulnerability assessment. And it can't be a checklist on an Excel sheet. Okay, it has to be a comprehensive report that is really making the link between the problem and the enterprise strategy and how that problem is going to impact the enterprise strategy.
Absolutely.
Excellent. All right, gentlemen. Well, that is all we have for questions and for talking points today. So if I think we've made it through. If you don't have anything else, then we'll sign off for the afternoon. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. My honor and pleasure. Have a great day, guys.
Right on. Take care. Thank you.